Yep, I think we're live. Hello, everybody, and a very happy sunny Friday. I'm Claire, the development manager here at Liftoff. I know we've got some Liftoff team members also in the chat room. We've definitely got James watching with us as well with his gorgeous little girl. Hello, Olive. So do talk away in the chat room to us. They'll be answering all your questions. I'm very excited to talk to you all about documentary today. This is one of my favourite areas of film. Always has been. I think whenever people ask you that question, what was it that made you want to go into film or TV, or what first sparked your love for film? I think for me, it was always documentary. I distinctly remember watching my first documentary, must have been about 10 years old. And I remember my mum coming downstairs, looking at the screen and going, I don't think you should be watching this. But of course, that just made me want to watch it even more. And it was my first proper understanding, I think, of animal rights, certainly environmental issues. And to this day, I guess it just has never failed to amaze me the power that film can have to be a vehicle for social awareness and change. I guess as I've got a little bit older, what I've also understood is just how important documentary is for filmmakers in general. And so today, what I really want us to sort of mainly be looking at is why I really think all filmmakers should seriously consider making documentary film content, the crossovers it has, the skills that it teaches you, and how it just absolutely makes narrative film work so much stronger. So here we go. So starting with why. Why should you make documentary film? So quite simply, we are living in what is an absolute golden age of documentary, which if you're a documentary geek like me, then it's just absolutely perfect. And I'm sure you've all witnessed this as well. So let's go back to 2018. So the amazing feature film Free Solo, which actually ended up winning the Oscar for Best Feature Doc, grossed over 28 million US dollars. Which was just unbelievable and up there in the records. 1 year later, Knock the House Down, an amazing documentary, broke Sundance's documentary sales records with what was reportedly a $10 million deal with Netflix. If you haven't seen this film, highly recommend it. It follows four outsider women, females, who are Congress candidates, including the absolute powerhouse Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I believe it's still on Netflix, so if you fancy watching a film about some seriously inspirational women, do check that out. So yeah, documentary is so popular with audiences, and therefore the likes of streaming content too, streaming platforms. I read something interesting a few days ago, actually, which was that potentially the rise in a particular love for genres like true crime kind of coincided with the boom of podcasts, which is an interesting comment. I guess an example of this is definitely the Serial Killer podcast, which I remember loving. And then not that long after that, of course, you had kind of the two versions of Ted Bundy on Netflix. So you had that fictionalized one with Zac Efron, and you had the In Conversation With. So there's definitely parallels there with what consumers are after at the moment. And we have seen this with our very own eyes. As we always say, Ben and James go to Cannes every year, have done for a long time now, and Natalie and myself very fortunately went for the first time last year. And what they call their documentary corner, which is where all the documentary specialist sales agents sort of sit in the marché, has just grown and grown over the years. So it's just absolute solid proof that the appetite is 100% there for documentaries. Good news. Okay, looking a little bit more now at the technical specifics of documentary and why this means you should be making this content. So obviously documentary can be presented as like a typical feature-length film. That's obviously the case. We see so many of those. Even in like a traditional structure, those typical 3-act structures. But the very nature of documentary, I think, lends itself to being episodic. You've got an unfolding story, you've got a timeline, or you've got the development of events. This lends itself to episodic content, and of course, streaming platforms love this. I mean, at the end of the day, they're subscription models. They need to keep their people engaged and renewing those subscriptions. So if they can recommission something, if there can be potentially another series, or even if it's just a mini series in itself, that is ideal for them, and they want to snap those up. I think just those two that are on the bottom there, we have seen this recently with the absolute phenomenon miniseries Tiger King and Don't Fuck with Cats. Both amazing, definitely worth checking out. Tiger King we will come back to because I'm sure nearly all of you have watched it. Don't Fuck with Cats was an interesting one that I just wanted to point out. Mark Lewis, the filmmaker of that, has a production company called Raw TV, and he had previously made a fantastic documentary for the BBC. Netflix actually saw that and loved it, and so they commissioned this documentary, which I just think is really interesting. Something we always say at Liftoff is that patience pays off, hard work pays off. These things don't just happen overnight. And it just shows that all that hard work ultimately ended up in this commission from Netflix. So, a little can go a long, long way with documentary. So true. So again, due to the nature of documentary, a very impressive project can be made by a skeleton crew. We see this all the time, don't we? So often it's just the filmmaker and their camera. I mean, maybe if you're shooting abroad, you're lucky and you've got a fixer, maybe you've got a producer with you, maybe you've got a DP with you. But generally speaking, a lot of these projects are done just single-handedly, or at least on the very minimum. A lot of the situations just don't demand for a large crew to be able to be there. You're often on your feet, on location. And similarly, I think it's worth pointing out that high-quality documentaries can be achieved on such a minimal budget. Again, you're not going to be able to be running around in a lot of these situations with the latest camera and 4 lights and a huge amount of sound equipment. It's just not possible. Maybe you're in a poverty-stricken area or a war-torn situation. You can't. The situation demands you to be discreet. I was thinking about a good example of this, and I think the one that just screams out to me was The White Helmets, which was an amazing short documentary, went on to win the Oscar, by Orlando von Eisendel. Sorry if I didn't pronounce that right. So that was back in 2016, and he followed the Syrian volunteer organisation called the White Helmets. Now, obviously, you can't be going around Damascus and Aleppo with a huge amount of kit and crew, but the results of what he achieved there were just phenomenal. Again, go and check that film out if you haven't already. But why is this important for narrative filmmakers? So, I think this is so important because at Liftoff, we always pride ourselves, we always have done, it's been the ethos of the company since the very beginning, on awarding the things that are free or very cheap to get right. We want good writing, good storytelling, originality, creativity, good performances. All of these things are the things that we are certainly awarding. This is what our judges are looking for. And so when the situations like documentaries demand for you to not be able to necessarily be using all that snazzy equipment, it's going to teach you how to get right the things that are free to get right. And we'll come back to that a little bit later again, actually. So in terms of actual skills, I was talking to James about this recently before making this presentation, and I was thinking, what would be the number one takeaway from making a documentary, in my opinion? And I think it's the flexibility. You haven't got a storyboard, but more importantly than that, you have got to be prepared for the fact that your overriding message that you want to impart on the documentary and the viewer can change. The narrative arc can change. You have to be flexible. So we're not talking about things like arriving on set and not being able to block out those skylights. Yes, that happened. We're also not talking about turning up and it suddenly starting snowing and ruining your continuity. That also happened, and that's very annoying. But I think these things are even more important, those massive fundamental ideas behind the film. And you've got to be ready for that and prepared for that to change if you want to make such an effective piece. I think that's a massive one. Actually, worth mentioning here, Tiger King, I said it would pop up again. I read a really interesting article on IndieWire, which was a sort of the making of with the filmmakers, Eric Goode and Rebecca Chaiklin. And they were talking about how their initial idea of Tiger King was to make a film about exotic pet ownership. As they say at the beginning of that documentary, which is just nuts, is that there are more big cats in captivity in the US than there are in the whole world, which is just absolutely mental. So anyway, they wanted to make a film about this. But what they found as they kept going through the project and all the filming was they just found this treasure trove of unbelievable characters. Oh, not characters. I guess that's the point. They're real people, not characters. So they found these people with insane stories, twists and turns that they weren't expecting, and just this absolute treasure trove of a colourful subculture. And so that's where it went. And in this article that I recommend reading, like I said, IndieWire, they talk about how they just had to be prepared for that narrative arc and the main really focus of the project to change. They thought it was going to be more idea driven, and it just wasn't in the end. But how amazing was it? It was in the end much more character driven, which is what we're going to talk about a lot today, how the importance of character driven narrative and the similarities, therefore, between understanding amazing character driven documentaries. Okay, I've waffled on enough about that, I feel. So, another massive skill that documentary teaches you. Interviews develop director skills. This is something I learnt. I think it's very easy to underestimate the skill of asking questions, of interviewing, especially when the cameras are rolling and when you're working with people who are not actors. That's such a key point. So I actually had a tiny bit of personal experience with this. My first steps into the industry was working as a junior casting researcher. And I would interview potential contributors and go on recce's to sort of interview them and send to the channel to see if they would be approved. And often after those first telephone interviews, you would get an idea in your head of what this contributor is going to represent in the project, what they'll bring to the screen. But often when you start interviewing them, it turns out that that's just not the case. What you thought they were going to reveal doesn't happen to be true. And the problem is, I think this has to be organic. You can't force it. That's so true, because otherwise they won't end up bringing what you wanted them to bring after all. So, as I've said here, you can't force words or a narrative onto interviewees. You have to develop the skill of asking the right questions, and importantly, in the right space, the right time, the right setting, in order to get the responses that you think you want. And this should be the case on any set, narrative sets as well. I know James mentioned this a few weeks ago in his workshop on how to direct actors, and he was talking about how the worst thing you can do as a director is say to an actor, I want you to say the line like this, and show them how to do it, because you're not respecting them as an artist. And it's the same skills. So you're just going to be absolutely honing that technique, which I think is very important. Okay, so now we're getting to sort of the bigger, meatier ones. Documentary gives you an unparalleled exposure to the importance of character within a story. Many documentaries prove time and time again that characterization is fundamental to storytelling. We've all seen the films I'm talking about, the ones where you are absolutely hooked in that person's life, in all the sides of their character that are coming out on screen right in front of you. And we've seen it with narrative work as well, how important that is, as we'll talk about a lot more. So the aim should always be to make your characters seem real, no matter how crazy the world is, even if the laws of physics don't apply. If you have humans in your story, they need to be real. And I just put there, Louis Theroux is the king of this. So is he a filmmaker? Is he a journalist? That's up to you to decide, but there's no doubt that he is the absolute king of finding the humanity in the people that he's filming. I read his autobiography that was published by Pan Macmillan this year, and one of the interesting things he says was when his first series, his first own show was commissioned, which was in the United States actually, it was his first Weird Weekends, he said that when he was watching back the completed episodes, especially the first few episodes, he very quickly realised that it's not effective to just be laughing at people. And he writes in his autobiography how he came very quickly to the understanding that no matter how cruel, no matter how bigoted or just weird the people he was filming are, he needed to find that universal humanity and empathy for them, because that ultimately creates a much more interesting audience response and viewer experience. So, documenting the lives of real people gives you the fundamental exposure to the vulnerabilities, the insecurities, and the flaws of the real human inside. These are real people that we're seeing and experiencing. So, without a strong understanding of vulnerability, the empathetic notes required to flesh out people within fictional work, genuine opportunities for building amazing characters could easily be overlooked in your writing, directing, and during your post-production. Sadly, we see this quite a lot at Liftoff. We see interesting ideas, unique stories, unique narratives, but the characters just aren't fleshed out enough. They're not real enough. Obviously, it helps if you're writing a story about something that you've got first-hand experiencing, but even still, like, the characters can fall flat. They can be a bit too two-dimensional. Sorry, that's a weird phrase. You know what I mean. We see it a lot, and it's a shame. So, vulnerability raises the stakes. It adds flaws to the flawless and ultimately creates a reality within fiction that not only is required, but tends to be lacking so much in this market of mass content. As I said, sadly, we see this a lot. So, adding flaws to the flawless. Getting into the heart and soul of a character is a great way to understand motive and decision making. Behind all great drama is the human truth of struggle, the clashing of personalities against obstacles, and the uniquely genius method seeing a high-stakes situation form within the perspective of another. It's how the writer's voice is removed from narrative work, and it's one of the core reasons why conceptors of fictional content love to watch documentaries. We were talking about this. So many narrative filmmakers will have a ton of documentaries they tell you to go and watch, the ones that they love and the ones that inspire them. As I said, don't you? Do say in the comments if you've got any favourite documentaries, because if I haven't seen them, I will be sure to check them out. So, we said Tiger King would keep popping up. Here it is again. So, when we first meet Doc Antle in Tiger King, the filmmaker shows us a behind-the-scenes moment where Doc is trying to manipulate the shoot. So this is the scene where he doesn't want the crew to come onto his property. He wants to meet them outside of his house. So many might see this as control, but underneath it is actually an extremely interesting character filled with fear, insecurities, probably about the world he's in, but also how the world perceives him and himself, his character. So now what I want us to look at is some filmmakers whose work crosses over between narrative and documentary. Phenomenal work. And I think a perfect example of this is Werner Herzog. So he's a great example of someone whose work switches well between documentary and narrative content. He's a master of characterization, and it's clear that his work on documentaries has informed his overall understanding of the human condition, mankind's relationship to one another, and to the world. So the original Tiger King, grisly man's tragically vulnerable and epically complex Timothy Treadwell, right the way through to his narrative work, including the connection with the characters portrayed by Klaus Kinski and Nicolas Cage in Bad Lieutenant. So in all of these situations, all of his films, Herzog understands the boundless possibilities of the human condition. And in my opinion, that is why his work is always so engaging, so real, raw and human. And likewise, I think one other person worth mentioning is definitely Spike Lee. To me, it's so clear that his non-fiction films, which often are exploring really tragic situations, and I think he's definitely interested in that idea of legacy, what we leave behind. But in all of his filmography, right the way through to BlacKkKlansman, his work is filled with such palpable emotion and vulnerability. And again, I think it's clear that his documentary work has assisted his depictions of this suffering and compassion in his fiction films. I mean, obviously, a lot of the time with him, that's ideas of race, black rights, the horrible inevitability of some of these deaths. Four Little Girls, just an amazing film, definitely worth checking out. But all the people that he's portrayed, obviously Michael Jackson, Jim Brown, Kobe Bryant, it all is so linked. It's such a seamless filmography, despite there being documentary and fiction. So now a shout out to one of our own network members, the lovely Sheila Marshall. So Sheila and Chris actually ended up winning our season award a few years ago for Best Feature Documentary with an amazing film called Right Between Your Ears. And that's the logline there. So through the eyes of people who became convinced of a date for the end of the world, Right Between Your Ears explores how people believe, how we turn beliefs into certainties, and how we mistake them for the truth. This was a phenomenal film that we all absolutely loved at Liftoff. Do go to that website there, the link will be in the description, and check it out. I believe you can watch this on Vimeo on demand. Definitely worth watching. But what's really interesting is that Sheila is now interested in moving into new areas. She's currently working on a comedy feature film that sounds really exciting, but it will be really interesting to see what she thinks her experience with this documentary project has taught her and what she'll be able to take forwards into these next projects, because I'm sure it will be a lot. We cannot wait to see this new work from her. So Sheila, we look forward to seeing your new stuff. You're amazing. So we've looked at the why I think you should all be making documentary content, and I'm biased, but I really do. Now I want to look briefly at how you achieve this, some of the sort of key tips that we've sort of picked up. And I think this is one of the most important ones. You do not need a breaking news story to make an award-winning documentary. I certainly had to learn this. I think everybody thinks that you need this huge story to make a really successful doc. And of course, if you have some massive scoop, that's amazing, but it's not necessary. I think this really hit home for me a few years ago when I went to a screening and a Q&A of a film by a director called Ed Perkins, he was commissioned by The Guardian. And in the Q&A, he spoke about how this short documentary, which was called Black Sheep, came about. And he said that he was approached by a young lad called Cornelius who wanted to have a coffee with him, discuss filmmaking, how he got into it, sort of just his general experiences. And Ed said that when he was asking Cornelius about his childhood, he couldn't believe how candidly and charismatically he spoke about his own experiences. And I love this. Apparently he just sort of turned around and said, do you know what? I think we should make a documentary about you. And Cornelius said, sure. So they ended up making this phenomenal short documentary all about Cornelius's experience as a British African growing up in London very shortly after the Damilola Taylor murder. And it's such a raw, vulnerable, open documentary that's just so fascinating to watch. Cornelius is so charismatic. They use very interesting reconstruction, but it's just fantastic. And would you believe it? A few months on, that ended up picking up an Oscar nomination. This was 2018? I might be wrong on that. But Black Sheep, Ed Perkins, definitely worth a watch. And don't bite off more than you can chew. Another cliche for a reason. I had to learn this one myself. So my first attempt, and I say attempt, at making a documentary was 1 year after the Paris Bataclan terror attack. I was born in Paris. I have a lot of love for that city, and I wanted to explore 1 year on how that had sort of affected the political and social landscapes in Paris. But it was just ridiculous because that was far, far too much to take on in one short documentary. Maybe even one of those would have been too much. I think it's that classic thing of if you end up trying to say a little about a lot, you end up saying nothing, and you're so much better off saying a lot about something small, if you followed me on that weird logic. I just think you want to do a subject justice. Again, we see this in documentaries sent to us at Liftoff, but we also see this in narrative work sent to us at Liftoff. Less, as I put there, one more cliche for good measure. I'm good at these cliches. Less really is more. It's the same with narrative. We see films that just try and take on too much in their 15 minutes. And again, we always talk about how you can fill the frame with narrative. You can say less with more in terms of dialogue. You can say a lot in a short film, but maybe you can't do character development justice, proper narrative development with 5 different characters in 4 different locations, all in one short film. It's just not possible. So I think it's such an important takeaway for documentary, but also narrative, that less is more. I certainly learned my lesson. Story discovery. I just wanted to say very, very quickly something about this because I went on a documentary course a few years ago before I started at Liftoff. And one of my questions, this was when I was still wanting that massive breaking news headline, was, well, where do you find these stories? And it's the same for narrative. Where do you come across something interesting? And so just some ideas that were thrown around when we had this workshop discussion. Google, obviously, massive, endless. But also newspapers, autobiographies, especially for documentary autobiographies, but fiction novels too. But interesting ones that I had certainly never considered, history books and websites, social studies, I think that's a really interesting one. Family, childhood stories, like Ed Perkins, with Cornelius, friends, stories of friends, myths, legends, all these places worth looking at for any kind of film project if you want that initial inspiration. Research, research, research. I think there's a lot that all filmmakers can learn from the methodical approach that is needed for a documentary. A lot of crossovers, a lot of similarities, but it needs to be even more precise with documentary, and I think that can teach us a lot. So often you want your working hypothesis, which, as we've spoken about, can change, but you do still need to have at least that through line in your mind decided on, which is going to have your initial ideas. It's connecting those to the message that you want to impart, your subjects, the events, the conflict, because you need a conflict in documentary too. You need that character development and structure. Pitching proposals. You could be doing this for a number of reasons: for funding, to be commissioned, to get your contributors on board. Maybe you need to pitch to them, or even just to gauge people's interest in a certain topic. And it's the same with narrative work, of course. It's definitely a skill people need to hone. It's tricky. An inventory, especially important if you think you're going to need lots of archive material and archive footage. Sound, you need to list everything you need. And again, same as narrative work, obviously, your rough shooting schedule, your budget, and your legal documentation. So as you can see, a lot of it is the same, but I just think, like I've said, the methodical approach that you need to take with it is something that narrative filmmakers can definitely take forwards. Invest and immerse. So a quote from Greg Mortensen there, not a filmmaker, but I thought it was apt. Slow down and make building relationships as important as building projects. I think this is so true, especially for documentary. I saw this myself. Back to the documentary I spoke about the terrorism in Paris and life 1 year after. I really wanted to get a mixture of demographics opinions on this doc, and I thought that it was so important to speak to a representative of the Islamic community. So I wanted to speak to an imam, and initially nobody would get back to me. I sent letters, I tried to phone, I actually approached them in person, and it was just no, no, no. So I kept going back to Paris multiple times, shooting different bits that I wanted to. And eventually I just had to send rushes, send a rough edit to try and show them what it was that I was trying to do, that I was coming at this from a genuine angle. And I think this is important. It's that the patience and dedication required to build the trust and relationships necessary between the filmmaker and your contributors is a lesson that would go a long way in narrative filmmaking too. So I just wanted to make that point. But now this is a big one as well. Again, another lesson that I have certainly had to learn. Your passion for the cause is not enough. In nearly every case, you're going to be making a documentary about something you care about, which is great. That's the whole point. But that doesn't mean you can come at this blindly and assume that your audience care or will care too, or even should care. I think it's important to earn that and remember that you have to earn that. It's the same with narrative. You might think you've got this unbelievable story that's really interesting. You might have fallen in love with your characters, but that doesn't mean we have as a viewer. Everything has to be earned. So, generally speaking, the documentaries that we see at Liftoff fall into two categories, largely speaking. So you've got what we call the journalist documentary or the filmmaker documentary. Both have their own merits. I personally think both styles can be amazing and very powerful, but speaking from an indie film festival's perspective, Of course, we prefer the latter. So, the investigative journalist docs, such as those that you see on Panorama, Louis Theroux, Stacey Dooley. Worth noting that Panorama is actually, the UK's longest running TV show, so we're not saying that these aren't effective, but we're coming at this from a filmmaker perspective. So they're often presenter-led, or they follow a filmmaker's journey as they're exploring that subject matter in front of us. Whereas the filmmaker docs, so these are your likes of Amy, Senna, Asif Kapadia's work, they tend to be what we call obstoc, observational, which is where the ego of that filmmaker is removed. And instead, you've got the narrative being led by the perspective of the contributors, and so often, like in both of those documentaries, archive material. So this teaches better filmmaking for narrative-driven work. I mean, archive material is just amazing and shouldn't be overlooked at all. Both of those, Asif Kapadia, I remember going to a talk when we were at Cannes, and he was speaking about the making of his latest one, Maradona. And he mentioned that they went through 500 hours of archive footage for that film. They needed 2 archive producers, but piecing it together is what created that amazing real story. I'm waffling now, so I'm going to move on. But I love all of his work, and again, highly recommend everyone checking it out. So, the big one. And in the words of the amazing Michael Moore, you need to appreciate the art form of cinema. Narrative work, documentary, music video, it doesn't matter, but this has always got to be surely your number one. So Michael Moore says, what is the first rule of Fight Club? The first rule of Fight Club, which also happens to be one of my favourite films, by the way, is don't talk about Fight Club. The first rule of documentaries is don't make a documentary, make a movie. You've chosen this art form, the cinema, this incredible, wonderful art form to tell your story. You didn't have to do that. Definitely worth looking at. So this actually comes from an article that I found on IndieWire, which is Michael Moore's 13 Rules for Making Documentary Films. If you're interested, if you like him as a person, I strongly recommend reading the whole article. It's very him in true fashion. Lots of swearing, lots of flippant remarks, but very amusing, and I think he's spot on. He's certainly not done too badly out of it, has he? So, in terms of the art form then, good documentary teaches us how to be inventive with visual storytelling. So this here is a still from what I think is my favourite documentary. So it's The Look of Silence by the wonderful Joshua Oppenheimer. This was actually it can be seen as a sequel to his other feature-length doc, both of which were Academy Award nominated, The Act of Killing, which looks at the Indonesian genocides. And they're just so visually spectacular, both of those. They're so beautiful to look at. Also worth noting, he did actually have a DP, something to consider, but just stunning films, and he's often cited as such an amazing visual storyteller. So this is a quote from Joshua. He says, "I tried to provide a series of spaces, tones, moods, environments that you smell and taste and feel as much as you see and hear them, that cumulatively form this big experience for the reviewer, and we can call that a story." Definitely worth watching these films. They're absolutely stunning, and you'll see what we're talking about. Those ideas that absolutely translate into narrative work. So we've done the before, we've done the during, now the after, which arguably is one of the most important sections of documentary making. The appreciation for perfect, and it has to be perfect, post-production. So as I've said there, in many ways, the edit is where all the power lies in documentary filmmaking. The post-production is such a crucial step in the process, and having a strong understanding of this will do wonders for your narrative projects. So, number one, you need to be ruthless in your edit. Talking about that 500 archive footage library with Diego Maradona, you have to be so ruthless with what you're doing. And that was before the shoot, certainly after the shoot. If we're talking about going back to The Look of Silence, that was the culmination of 13 years in Indonesia. Can you imagine how much footage, they would have had? And you just have to be so ruthless with getting that down to the bare bones of the story that you want. Number two, you need to put together a visually driven film. Actions, not words, need to drive the narrative in order to make it cinematic. Again, it's going back to that point of appreciate the art form. You're not writing you're not writing a piece, a column, an opinion piece in a newspaper. You've chosen to make a brilliant film. You need a strong structure with a developing narrative arc. As we spoke about, this may be different to the one you originally planned, but the edit is your second chance at directing. It's your second shot at forming that development that you need to hook that audience and keep it interesting. And lastly, you need to maintain objectivity as much as humanly possible. So difficult in documentary especially, difficult in filmmaking in general. One of actually the other things on Michael Moore's tips, his 13 tips for documentary filmmaking, is try and only include the people that disagree with you. I'm not sure whether I agree with that, but it's an interesting point. And the point is, keep it interesting, remain objective, and again, I guess that's linked to being ruthless. These things are all linked. But it's the same with narrative, same with narrative editing. You need to stick to all these rules in order to create the most impactful and effective piece possible. So I wanted to end on a quote from the absolute documentary pioneer that was obviously John Grierson. He actually, just a fun fact for the day, he actually coined the term documentary in when looking at one of the first documentaries ever made in 1922 by a guy called Robert Flaherty in the States. Anyway, I digress, but here's a lovely quote to end on. So in documentary, we deal with the actual and in one sense with the real, but the really real, if I may use that phrase, is something deeper than that. The only reality which counts in the end is the interpretation, which is profound. And I just wanted to end there because I just think what better way to summarise it. And it's why we all love cinema, it's why we all love film, and it's what we can all strive for, no matter what kind of film you're making. So that kind of concludes the workshop today on documentary. Just got a few more lift-off news and updates things to run through now. Very excitingly, we have the Manchester Lift-Off Filmmaker Winners Roundtable on Sunday evening at 8 o'clock British Summer Time. So this is where we're going to be talking to the 3 directors of the winning films selected from the network round of the festival. And we're super excited. We're going to be doing these more and more frequently. It's going to be so great to hear from the horse's mouth all about their films and their process. So do join us for that. You can set a reminder for that with the links in this description. Are you a filmmaker looking to launch your career? Documentary, narrative, doesn't matter. So we have our professional membership. So for the fee of $189 for the year, it includes a whole wealth of benefits, free submissions to all our festivals and showcases, that's 26 different events on Film Freeway, career road mapping, tailored advice. When we get these up and running again, we'll have a live audience for these, so you can join us at our home in Pinewood Studios, jobs dashboards, and one of the big ones, film market representation at all the major markets. As I'm sure you saw, Cannes have announced that they're going to be running a very special online space, running all the seminars, all the workshops in the Marché as usual, so we'll keep you updated on that as well. Just go to liftoff.network/membership for it. Also worth noting, production launch workshops. If you're looking at ways to kind of fill your time at the moment, we have 4 fantastic modules, completely free. These are done by our other co-founder, Ben Pullman. And to sign up to those, again, just go to our website and register at www.liftoff.network. And that's the end. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining me. I know James, Natalie, Jamie, Lauren have been answering all your questions there in the chat. So I think that's everything from us. Thank you so much, guys, and now I hope you all enjoy the rest of this beautiful sunshine while we're in lockdown. We will see you soon. Thanks a lot.